My beloved child, something shifted quietly when no one was prepared for it, and the strange part is that your soulmate did not announce the change, explain it, or ask anyone for permission. They simply reached a point where continuing the old pattern felt heavier than finally telling themselves the truth. For a long time, the third party believed there was still plenty of time. Time for feelings to fade. Time for your soulmate to become comfortable with distance. Time for unanswered questions about you to slowly disappear beneath ordinary life. From the outside, that assumption almost made sense. Your soulmate had been quiet. They had hesitated. They had tried to act as though everything inside them could be placed neatly into a corner and forgotten. But silence can hide movement, and hesitation does not always mean someone has stopped caring. Sometimes hesitation is what happens when a person realizes that one decision could rearrange everything they have grown accustomed to. And somewhere inside your soulmate, that realization had been growing stronger. They were beginning to understand that avoiding a feeling does not erase it. It only teaches you how much energy you have been spending trying not to look at it. What happened next was subtle enough that almost everyone missed it. Your soulmate stopped defending the situation they had been tolerating. Not dramatically. Not through some explosive moment. They simply stopped making excuses for why things had to remain exactly as they were. That was the first crack in the old story. The third party noticed something was different, but they misunderstood what they were seeing. They assumed your soulmate needed more reassurance, more time, perhaps another reason to remain where they were. What they did not realize was that your soulmate had already begun asking themselves a completely different question: if I keep choosing what is familiar simply because it is familiar, what happens to the part of me that knows what I actually want? Don't skip, because the answer to that question became the beginning of the one thing the third party had quietly feared. Your soulmate started choosing clarity over convenience. It began in tiny ways. A conversation they no longer avoided. A memory of you they finally allowed themselves to sit with instead of immediately distracting themselves. A moment late in the day when your name crossed their mind and, instead of pushing it away, they wondered why thoughts of you still carried a warmth that other connections could not easily reproduce. Something important is waiting for you inside that realization, because your soulmate was not comparing appearances anymore. They were comparing how different versions of themselves felt around different people. Around one connection, they felt as though they were constantly performing, explaining, adjusting, proving. But when they remembered you, what returned was something quieter, the memory of being understood without having to translate every part of themselves. And that difference became impossible to ignore. There was another detail, though, and this is where the story changes direction. The third party had been waiting for your soulmate to make a choice later. They believed later protected them. Later meant nothing had to change today. Later meant difficult questions could remain unanswered. Later meant the connection between you and your soulmate might eventually become nothing more than a distant memory. But your soulmate suddenly realized that later was becoming a hiding place. Imagine the moment, an ordinary evening, no dramatic music, no grand announcement, just a person sitting alone with a truth they had delayed for far too long. Your soulmate thought about how many times they had nearly reached toward you and stopped. How many words they had rewritten in their mind but never sent. How many times they had told themselves, "Not yet," only to discover that "not yet" was quietly becoming "maybe never." That thought affected them more deeply than they expected. Because losing you through an unavoidable circumstance would have been one thing. Losing the possibility of you simply because they were too afraid to be honest with themselves felt entirely different. Stay till the end, because what they did after this was not what the third party expected. Your soulmate made one internal decision before making any external move. They decided they would no longer let another person's comfort determine what they were allowed to feel. That was it. That was the thing the third party feared most, not some dramatic confrontation, but your soulmate becoming emotionally independent enough to make a sincere decision. Suddenly, persuasion had less power. Guilt had less power. Old routines had less power. Even uncertainty had less power, because your soulmate was beginning to understand that clarity does not mean knowing exactly how everything will end. Sometimes clarity simply means knowing what you can no longer pretend not to feel. And your soulmate could no longer pretend that you were insignificant. Yet there is something even more revealing here. They did not immediately rush toward you. In fact, their first instinct was to slow down. Why? Because this time they did not want to approach you with confusion. They did not want to bring unfinished emotions, half-decisions, or vague promises into your world. Something about you made them want to arrive differently, more certain, more accountable, more willing to stand behind whatever they said. That is when the third party noticed the emotional distance. Not distance created through anger, but the kind that appears when someone has quietly stopped negotiating with themselves. Questions that once pulled your soulmate back into confusion no longer worked the same way. Familiar arguments sounded different. Old expectations felt strangely small. And the third party began realizing that the time they thought they had might never have belonged to them in the first place. Your soulmate was not being taken away. They were waking up to the fact that their choices were theirs. Pause here for just a moment and notice what makes this meaningful for you. The deepest part of this story is not that someone finally chose you over someone else. Your worth was never supposed to depend on winning a comparison. The deeper shift is that your soulmate began seeing the difference between choosing from pressure and choosing from truth. And when someone reaches that realization sincerely, their next movement tends to become quieter but more intentional. This is why your soulmate did something they had resisted for so long. They began preparing to speak plainly. No mixed signals. No carefully hidden meaning. No pretending that the connection between you could be reduced to coincidence or convenience. They wanted to acknowledge what had been left unfinished. But there was one problem. The moment they imagined actually saying it to you, another realization stopped them completely. They suddenly wondered whether you were still standing in the same emotional place where they had left you. What if you had changed? What if waiting had taught you something? What if the version of you they remembered was no longer willing to accept uncertainty simply because love existed beneath it? That question humbled them. Because for the first time, your soulmate was not only thinking about what they wanted from you. They were thinking about what you deserved from them. And that distinction changed the entire emotional atmosphere. The third party could sense that your soulmate's attention had moved somewhere they could no longer easily reach. Not necessarily toward a person in a physical sense, but toward a truth within themselves. And once that happened, the countdown they thought they controlled disappeared. There was no more comfortable someday. There was only the growing awareness that choices postponed long enough can eventually become choices made by circumstance. Your soulmate did not want circumstance deciding this one. So they reached for something connected to you, something small, something they had kept longer than anyone knew. And when they looked at it again, a memory returned with such clarity that they finally understood why letting go had never worked the way they expected. But the memory itself was not what surprised them most. It was what they noticed about it this time, one detail they had completely overlooked before, a detail that would shape what they decided to do next. The detail was so small that your soulmate almost dismissed it, yet once they saw it clearly, they could not return to the old interpretation of what had happened between you. It was not a dramatic confession hidden inside a message, nor some obvious sign they had somehow missed. It was something quieter, a moment when you had given them room to choose without forcing them toward you. At the time, they mistook your restraint for distance. They thought perhaps you did not care enough to fight harder, explain more, or keep proving what you felt. But now, looking back with different eyes, they understood something that unsettled them in the gentlest possible way. You had not stepped back because your feelings were shallow. You had stepped back because you respected yourself enough not to chase someone who was still undecided. And suddenly, a memory that once seemed ordinary became impossible to forget. Your soulmate remembered the tone of your voice, the way you had allowed silence to exist without filling it with desperation, the way you had never demanded a promise they were not ready to give. What if the very thing they once misunderstood about you was the thing that made you different from everyone else? That question remained with them longer than they expected. Because the third party had believed time would weaken your place in your soulmate's heart, yet time was doing something completely different. It was giving your soulmate enough distance to understand you more accurately. The things they once overlooked were gaining meaning. The moments they thought were simple were becoming evidence of something deeper. And the strange truth was that your absence had begun teaching them what your presence had offered. Don't skip, because this is where their internal decision started becoming visible. Your soulmate began changing the way they responded whenever your name, your memory, or anything connected to you entered the conversation. Earlier, they might have changed the subject quickly. They might have laughed something off, acted indifferent, or offered an explanation designed to keep everyone comfortable. Now they stopped doing that. They did not become dramatic. They simply became still. And that stillness said more than any argument could have. The third party noticed. Of course they noticed. People often recognize emotional changes long before they understand what caused them. A shorter answer here. A thoughtful pause there. Your soulmate no longer rushing to reassure them whenever uncertainty appeared. Something had changed beneath the surface, and the third party could feel that their familiar methods of restoring certainty were no longer creating the same response. Yet what they feared was not necessarily that your soulmate would immediately run toward you. It was something more fundamental. They feared that your soulmate was becoming brave enough to admit the truth to themselves, because once a person stops lying to their own heart, every relationship around them begins to look different. Stay till the end, because your soulmate's next realization was even more personal. They began thinking about the version of themselves you had known. Not the polished version. Not the confident version they showed everyone else. You had seen the uncertain pauses, the contradictions, the moments when they wanted closeness and then suddenly pulled away. You had witnessed parts of them they were not especially proud of. Yet somehow, your memory was not attached only to embarrassment. It was attached to something unexpectedly comforting. You had seen them unfinished. And perhaps that was why remembering you felt different. With you, they had not needed to become perfect before being understood. That thought reached somewhere deep. Because your soulmate had spent a long time believing love should feel like proving your value. Show enough. Give enough. Perform well enough. Be interesting enough. Stay useful enough. But their memories of you challenged that entire belief. You had offered moments in which they could simply exist, and because those moments had not demanded attention, your soulmate had underestimated their importance. Now they understood why certain memories returned during the quietest hours. It was not because the past was calling them backward. It was because part of them was comparing the emotional honesty they once experienced with the life they were living now. And once that comparison began, the third party's assumption that they had endless time became increasingly fragile. Then came the moment no one else saw. Your soulmate opened something connected to you that they had deliberately avoided for longer than they wanted to admit. Perhaps it was an old conversation, a photograph, a saved note, or simply a memory attached to a familiar place. Whatever form it took, the effect was the same. Their intention had been simple: look once, understand what they were feeling, then close it and continue with the evening. But one line, one expression, one ordinary detail made them stop. You had said something that had seemed almost insignificant then. It was not a promise. It was not a declaration. It was something about wanting them to choose what was genuinely right for them, even if the answer was difficult. Your soulmate read or remembered it again, and for the first time they heard what was beneath it. You were giving them freedom even when that freedom could have cost you the connection. That is rare. And they knew it. Suddenly, the question was no longer, why can't I forget this person? It became, why did I walk away from someone who never tried to control me? That question changed the temperature of the entire night. Something important is waiting for you here, because your soulmate did not immediately turn this realization into fantasy. They began confronting themselves instead. They remembered the moments when they had expected you to understand silence they never explained. They remembered leaving you to guess what they were feeling. They remembered assuming that if the connection was strong enough, you would simply wait while they figured everything out. And now they saw how unfair that expectation had been. You were never supposed to place your life on hold while someone else found the courage to become clear. This realization did not make your soulmate feel defeated. It made them mature. For once, they understood that missing you was not enough. Caring was not enough. Even privately knowing what they wanted was not enough. If they wanted a meaningful place in your life, they would eventually have to communicate with the same honesty they had once expected you to somehow sense without words. And this was exactly where the third party lost the advantage they thought time had given them. Because your soulmate was no longer measuring their choices by what created the least immediate discomfort. They were beginning to measure them by what they could live with long term. Imagine two roads appearing inside someone's mind. One road looks familiar, predictable, easy to explain to everyone. It requires very little courage today, but every step comes with the quiet question of what might have happened if they had been honest. The other road contains uncertainty. It asks for accountability. It may require difficult conversations. But somewhere along that road is the possibility of becoming the person they have been quietly trying to become. Your soulmate could finally see both roads clearly. And they knew which one scared them more. Surprisingly, it was not the uncertain road. It was the familiar one. The idea of waking up months later still wondering whether they had abandoned something meaningful because they lacked courage had started to feel heavier than the risk of finally speaking. That is when they did the thing the third party feared most. Your soulmate stopped asking everyone else what they should do. No more collecting opinions until they found the easiest answer. No more allowing another person's reaction to determine their direction. No more turning a deeply personal truth into a committee decision. They began listening inward. And once they did, your name returned not loudly, not obsessively, but steadily. Your soulmate pictured speaking with you again, but this time they imagined something different. They did not picture arriving with grand promises. They pictured telling the truth. I was confused. I should have communicated better. I understand now that my silence affected you. I do not know what you feel today, but I do know what I need to say. Those imagined words frightened them because they were simple. Simple words leave nowhere to hide. And yet beneath the nervousness came relief. Perhaps truth did not need to be spectacular to matter. Perhaps the most powerful thing they could offer you was not a dramatic gesture but clarity. Meanwhile, the third party felt another shift. They tried bringing up future plans in the same casual way they had before, expecting your soulmate to respond automatically. But this time your soulmate hesitated. Just for a second. Maybe no one else would have noticed. Yet the third party did, because that hesitation contained something new. Your soulmate was no longer willing to make promises merely to calm the present moment. They had learned that promises made from pressure eventually become resentment. So they answered carefully. And the third party finally understood what had been changing. Your soulmate was protecting their future from decisions made out of guilt. That was the one thing they had hoped would never happen. Not rejection. Not conflict. Independence. The freedom to say, I need to decide this for myself. And with those words, whether spoken aloud or silently within, your soulmate crossed an invisible line. But here is where everything becomes even more interesting. Their thoughts were moving toward you, yet another question appeared, one they had not prepared for. What if contacting you was not the courageous part? What if the courageous part was being willing to hear whatever answer you gave? Your soulmate realized they could not approach you expecting immediate warmth, instant forgiveness, or a return to exactly where things had been. You had your own journey. Your own emotions. Your own lessons. If they truly respected you, they would have to respect your answer too. That realization softened them. Instead of rehearsing how to convince you, they started thinking about how to understand you. Instead of asking, how do I get them back? They began asking, what would it mean to meet them honestly where they are now? Can you feel the difference? One question is about possession. The other is about connection. And your soulmate was finally beginning to understand that genuine connection cannot be forced into existence. It can only be invited through truth. For several minutes, they sat there with their phone nearby. They reached toward it once, then stopped. Not because they had changed their mind. Something deeper was happening. They wanted the first words to come from clarity, not panic. They refused to send another vague message that would leave you decoding what they meant. So they began typing something more honest. A few words appeared. Then disappeared. Another sentence. Deleted. They tried again. And somewhere in that process, your soulmate noticed that the hardest sentence was also the most important one. It was the sentence admitting what they had finally understood about you. They stared at it for a long moment. Then, for the first time, they did not delete it. But just as they were preparing to continue, something unexpected happened, something connected to the third party that revealed they had noticed far more than your soulmate realized. And what they said next forced your soulmate to make another choice much sooner than anyone had expected. The third party did not raise their voice, create a scene, or demand an immediate explanation. Instead, they asked one quiet question that landed with far more weight than anything dramatic could have carried. Are you still thinking about them? Your soulmate had heard versions of that question before, but this time something was different. In the past, they might have rushed to soften the answer. They might have said, "It's complicated," or "It doesn't matter," or simply changed the subject to avoid making the moment uncomfortable. But now the old escape routes felt strangely dishonest. For several seconds, your soulmate said nothing. And in that silence, the third party understood more than they wanted to. Because silence has a different meaning when someone is no longer searching for an excuse. Your soulmate was searching for courage. What happened next was subtle, but it changed everything. They did not deny you. They did not minimize what had existed. They did not pretend your name belonged to some finished chapter just to make another person feel secure. Instead, your soulmate said something simple: "I've been thinking about what I actually want." Nothing harsh. Nothing disrespectful. Just the truth. And that single sentence disturbed the balance that had existed for so long, because the third party had believed your soulmate's uncertainty was permanent. They thought hesitation meant control could continue. They believed there would always be another day to redirect the conversation, another week to make the familiar path feel easier, another month before your soulmate finally faced what was happening inside. But suddenly, time did not feel endless anymore. Your soulmate had begun moving. Not physically toward you yet, but emotionally toward honesty. And once someone starts choosing honesty, every comfortable illusion around them becomes harder to maintain. Don't skip, because what your soulmate admitted next was the part no one had expected. They said they were tired of making choices simply because those choices created the least conflict. They were tired of being afraid that disappointing someone meant they were doing something wrong. They were tired of convincing themselves that staying confused was kinder than being clear. That realization had been building quietly, but saying it aloud made it real. The third party listened, perhaps hoping your soulmate would eventually walk the words backward, soften them, or offer reassurance that nothing meaningful was changing. But your soulmate did not. For the first time, they allowed an uncomfortable truth to remain in the room without immediately trying to erase it. And strangely, that discomfort brought them peace. Because every previous attempt to keep everyone comfortable had only created more confusion. Your soulmate could finally see the pattern. Every time they avoided one difficult conversation, they created several smaller wounds later. Every time they delayed choosing, someone else ended up carrying the uncertainty. And if they continued that way, you might eventually become another person they had hurt simply because they were afraid to speak clearly. Something important is waiting for you inside this moment. Your soulmate suddenly understood that choosing you was never supposed to mean defeating another person. It meant choosing the version of themselves capable of honesty. The third party was not being treated as an enemy, and you were not being treated like a prize. Your soulmate had matured enough to see that every person involved deserved clarity. That included you. That included the third party. And perhaps most importantly, it included themselves. So they made another decision. They would not continue one connection merely because leaving it was difficult, and they would not approach you simply because missing you was painful. They wanted every step from this point forward to come from something deeper than fear, loneliness, or impulse. They wanted their next choice to be something they could still respect when emotions became quieter. That might sound small, but for your soulmate it was enormous. For so long, they had reacted to whatever emotion was loudest in the moment. If guilt was loud, they stayed. If longing was loud, they thought about you. If uncertainty was loud, they did nothing. Now they were learning to ask a steadier question: what is true even when the emotion changes? And every time they asked it, one answer kept returning. The connection with you had not disappeared. The things left unsaid had not disappeared. The responsibility to finally be honest had not disappeared. Stay till the end, because this is where your soulmate did something that surprised even themselves. They placed the phone down. Not because they no longer wanted to message you, but because they realized contacting you before resolving the situation around them would only pull you back into confusion. They did not want you receiving a beautiful message tonight and waking tomorrow to another round of uncertainty. They did not want to ask you for emotional access while still avoiding responsibility elsewhere. So they chose patience, but this time, patience meant action instead of delay. They turned back toward the difficult conversation. The third party asked, "What does this mean for us?" And your soulmate took a long breath. They knew there was no perfectly painless sentence. Sometimes kindness is not making a difficult truth disappear, sometimes kindness is refusing to disguise it. Your soulmate explained that something had changed within them. They had been trying to make the relationship fit a future they were no longer certain they wanted. They had been telling themselves that commitment meant ignoring doubts, when perhaps real commitment required being honest about them. They did not blame anyone. They did not mention you as a weapon. They simply acknowledged their own responsibility. And that made the conversation impossible to dismiss. Because the third party had expected one of two things: either your soulmate would continue avoiding the subject, or they would become emotional enough that everything could later be blamed on a temporary mood. Neither happened. Your soulmate remained calm, thoughtful, almost surprisingly grounded. The third party realized then that this had not started tonight. Tonight was simply the first time it had been spoken aloud. Behind your soulmate's calmness were weeks, perhaps months, of tiny realizations accumulating. The places where they no longer felt like themselves. The moments when they imagined the future and something felt absent. The memories of you that returned whenever they wondered what emotional ease used to feel like. The regret surrounding things they never explained. The growing discomfort of pretending that all of those thoughts meant nothing. Your soulmate finally understood something they had resisted: unresolved feelings rarely disappear just because life becomes busy. Sometimes they become quieter, but quiet is not the same as gone. And now those feelings were asking for honesty, not fantasy. There was one particular memory they kept returning to. A moment between you when nothing spectacular had happened. Maybe you were talking about ordinary things. Maybe you shared a laugh. Maybe there had simply been a peaceful silence where neither of you needed to impress the other. Your soulmate used to overlook that moment because there was no dramatic declaration attached to it. Now they understood why it mattered. Peace can be easy to underestimate until life becomes complicated. When they remembered being near you, they remembered feeling less divided inside themselves. That did not automatically mean the past could be recreated. Your soulmate knew that. Both of you had changed. But it did tell them something important. Whatever happened next, they wanted relationships where they did not have to continuously abandon parts of themselves to maintain harmony. This was becoming bigger than choosing between two people. It was about learning how they wanted to love. The third party eventually asked a harder question: is this because of them? Your soulmate looked away for a moment, because the easiest answer would have been yes. Blaming one person would have simplified everything. But they knew the truth was more complex. You had become part of the awakening, but you were not the cause of every problem. The real issue was that your soulmate had spent too long ignoring their own inner voice. So they answered carefully: thinking about them made me realize what I've been avoiding, but I have to take responsibility for my own choices. That sentence changed the atmosphere again. There was no accusation to argue against. No villain to defeat. No dramatic misunderstanding to solve. There was simply a person recognizing that their life had become misaligned with what they truly felt. And the third party understood that persuading someone out of that realization would be far more difficult than competing with another person. Because your soulmate was not just moving toward you. They were moving toward themselves. After the conversation ended, the room felt unusually quiet. Your soulmate expected to feel panic. Instead, they felt sadness mixed with relief. Sadness because any meaningful transition carries emotion. Relief because they had finally stopped pretending. And underneath both feelings was something they had not experienced in a long time: direction. They picked up their phone again. Your conversation was still there. The unfinished message still waited. But now something about the words felt different. Earlier, they had been writing from longing. Now they were writing from accountability. They removed one line that sounded too dramatic. They changed another that seemed to place responsibility on you. Then they added something simple: I don't expect you to know what to say. I just realized I owe you honesty. Your soulmate stared at that sentence. Their thumb hovered above the screen. For several seconds, they almost sent it. Then another thought stopped them. Not fear this time. Respect. What if you were sleeping? What if your life had moved forward? What if receiving a sudden emotional message without context disturbed the peace you had worked hard to rebuild? Your soulmate began realizing that even truth requires timing. This was new for them. In the past, they thought courage meant acting immediately. Now they understood that mature courage also asks, how will my action affect the other person? So instead of sending the message impulsively, they saved it. They decided that when they reached toward you, they wanted to do it with enough clarity to answer the questions you might naturally have. Why now? What changed? What exactly are you asking from me? Those questions did not frighten them anymore. They knew you had every right to ask. In fact, thinking about your questions made them understand something beautiful. You were no longer an idea in their mind. You were a real person with boundaries, feelings, and a life beyond their longing. And perhaps that was the most important change of all. Your soulmate was finally learning to love you without assuming ownership of your response. They could offer honesty. They could offer accountability. They could offer effort. But they could not control what you chose to do with those things. Strangely, accepting that gave them even more courage. Because now their purpose was not to guarantee an outcome. Their purpose was simply to stop hiding. Then something unexpected appeared on the screen. A small reminder connected to you, something so ordinary that under different circumstances they might have ignored it. A date. A saved note. A photograph resurfacing automatically. Maybe even a place attached to an old memory. But whatever it was, it brought back one specific sentence you once told them. And unlike everything else they had remembered tonight, these words were not comforting. They challenged them. You had once said, in your own way, that someday they would have to decide whether they were more afraid of change or more afraid of regret. Your soulmate had not understood why that sentence stayed with them. Now they did. Because tonight, the answer had finally changed. They were no longer most afraid of change. They were afraid of waking up much later and realizing they had watched something meaningful disappear while waiting for certainty that could never exist. And this was where the third party's greatest assumption finally collapsed. They had believed your soulmate needed more time. But your soulmate had just realized that time itself would never make the decision for them. More weeks would not create courage. More months would not provide perfect certainty. At some point, they had to choose how they wanted to live. And late that night, they made a promise to themselves, not a promise about what you would do, not a promise about some guaranteed future, but something far more grounded. They promised that the next time they spoke to you, they would tell the whole truth. Yet there was still one truth your soulmate had not fully admitted, even privately. It concerned the real reason they had pulled away from you in the first place. They had spent a long time believing they knew why they left. But as the night grew quieter, one memory surfaced that challenged the entire explanation. And once they finally understood what had actually scared them back then, your soulmate realized the story between you had never been what they thought it was. The truth your soulmate had avoided for so long was not that they stopped caring about you. It was almost the opposite. They had pulled away because being genuinely seen by you made everything inside them feel more real than they were prepared to handle. With other people, they could stay partly hidden. They could present the version of themselves that felt safe, agreeable, uncomplicated. But around you, small things seemed to matter. You noticed when their energy changed. You remembered details they assumed no one would remember. You could sense when their words said one thing while their heart seemed to be carrying another. And at the time, that kind of closeness did not feel peaceful to them. It felt unfamiliar. Your soulmate had confused emotional exposure with danger, not because you had done anything wrong, but because they had never learned how to remain present when something mattered deeply. So when the connection began asking for honesty, they chose distance. When it asked for vulnerability, they chose silence. When it began feeling like something that could truly affect their future, they told themselves they needed more time. And now, sitting with the memory years, months, or perhaps only weeks later, they could finally see the pattern clearly. They had not been running from you. They had been running from the version of themselves they would have needed to become in order to love you well. That realization was difficult, but strangely freeing. Because if the problem had simply been that you were wrong for them, there would have been nothing left to understand. But if the real problem had been fear of emotional responsibility, then their entire interpretation of the past needed to change. Don't skip, because this is where the third party's position became even more fragile without anyone needing to fight for anything. Your soulmate began noticing how often they had chosen relationships and situations that allowed them to remain emotionally comfortable. Familiar patterns asked less of them. They could avoid difficult conversations. They could stay slightly detached. They could keep one foot outside the door and call it independence. But your connection had quietly asked a different question: can you stay when staying requires honesty? They had not been ready then. The surprising part was that they might be ready now. Not because they suddenly became fearless, but because they were finally tired of letting fear make important decisions for them. There is a difference between being unafraid and being willing. Your soulmate was beginning to understand that willingness was enough to take the next step. Something important is waiting for you in what happened the following morning. They woke earlier than usual, carrying that strange emotional clarity that sometimes follows a night of difficult truth. For a few seconds, everything felt normal. Then the memories returned. The conversation with the third party. The unfinished message to you. The realization about why they had originally stepped away. And beneath all of it was a question they could no longer postpone: what kind of person do I want to be when I finally speak to them? Notice that the question was no longer, how do I make them choose me? That old mindset was fading. Your soulmate was starting to think about what they could actually bring into your life. Stability? Honesty? Consistency? Respect? Could they communicate instead of disappearing? Could they listen if your answer was difficult? Could they accept that you might need time? These questions mattered because your soulmate understood something they once overlooked: strong feelings can open a door, but only character can keep a meaningful connection healthy once you walk through it. So instead of immediately reaching for their phone, they began making quiet decisions about themselves. They would stop using confusion as an excuse for inconsistency. They would not make promises simply because a moment felt emotional. They would explain what they meant instead of expecting you to interpret silence. And perhaps most importantly, they would not approach you as though your love was something waiting on a shelf exactly where they had left it. You had lived while they were deciding. You had grown. You had learned things. You may have built stronger boundaries. Your soulmate understood that meeting you again would mean meeting who you are now, not demanding the version of you they remembered. This realization softened something inside them. For the first time, the thought of you was not accompanied only by longing. It carried respect. And respect changed the way they imagined every next step. Meanwhile, the third party was experiencing their own realization. They had expected the difficult conversation from the previous night to pass like other uncomfortable moments had passed before. Sleep on it. Distract yourselves. Return to routine. Let familiarity cover whatever had been exposed. But morning arrived, and your soulmate did not retreat from what they had said. Their energy remained calm. Their words remained measured. They were not acting cold, yet they were no longer pretending that everything could continue unchanged. The third party sensed it immediately. This was not a mood. It was a boundary forming. And boundaries are difficult to argue with because they do not require anyone else to agree with them. Your soulmate was simply saying, through their choices, I cannot keep living against what I know anymore. Stay till the end, because there was one conversation that finally made the third party understand how serious the change had become. They asked your soulmate whether they simply needed a little space and whether, after enough time, everything could return to normal. Your soulmate almost said yes. The old version of them would have done exactly that. A vague answer would buy time. It would reduce tension. It would postpone consequences. But then they remembered you. Not because they wanted to compare anyone, but because remembering what happened between you reminded them of the price of vague answers. They had already learned what uncertainty could do when left unresolved. So your soulmate said something they had probably needed to say much earlier. I don't want to promise a return to something I'm not sure I still want. That sentence was gentle, but definitive enough to change the atmosphere. The third party realized that waiting was no longer their strategy because time was no longer working in their favor. Every hour of reflection seemed to make your soulmate clearer instead of more confused. And the irony was impossible to miss. The third party had believed delaying everything would eventually weaken your importance. Instead, delay had given your soulmate enough distance to understand what they had lost. Then came another unexpected shift. Your soulmate began remembering not only the good moments with you, but the moments when you had been hurt by their inconsistency. This could have become a spiral of guilt, but something different happened. They stopped using regret to punish themselves and began using it as information. What would I do differently now? They wondered. They pictured the conversations where they had gone quiet instead of answering. Now they imagined staying present. They remembered moments when you had needed reassurance and they had become defensive. Now they imagined listening before responding. They remembered assuming that strong chemistry would somehow solve problems without effort. Now they understood that real closeness requires communication when chemistry is not enough. Each memory became less about wishing the past were different and more about becoming different in the future. That was the transformation the third party could not see from the outside. Your soulmate was no longer simply missing you. They were learning from what happened with you. And there is a powerful difference between those two things. Missing someone can remain a private emotion forever. Learning from them can change the choices you make next. A little later, your soulmate opened the message again. The sentence from the night before was still there. I don't expect you to know what to say. I just realized I owe you honesty. They read it twice. This time they did not edit it immediately. Instead, they added another line. I also understand that I disappeared into confusion when I should have communicated. That sentence felt vulnerable. It admitted responsibility without trying to manipulate your response. Your soulmate stared at it for a while, then added something even harder. If you don't want to reopen this, I'll respect that. Their chest tightened when they read those words. Because until that moment, some hidden part of them had still been hoping they could control the outcome if only they found the perfect message. Now they were releasing that illusion. Real honesty could invite you, but it could not obligate you. And strangely, once they accepted that, the message became easier to write. They stopped trying to sound impressive. They stopped searching for a dramatic opening. They simply told the truth. Yet they still did not send it. Not yet. There was one more piece they wanted to understand first. Why had thoughts of you returned with such intensity now? Was it simply because their current relationship was changing, or had something deeper been building long before the third party noticed? Your soulmate began tracing the timeline backward. And what they discovered surprised them. Thoughts of you had not returned recently. They had been there quietly for much longer. Hidden inside ordinary moments. A song they almost skipped because it reminded them of a conversation. A street they avoided taking because it passed a place connected to you. A joke they nearly sent you before remembering you were no longer part of their daily life. A moment of good news when your name appeared first in their mind before they told anyone else. Individually, each moment meant little. Together, they formed a pattern. Your soulmate realized they had been carrying the connection forward privately even while publicly behaving as though it had ended. And this recognition changed the question again. It was no longer, why am I thinking about them now? It became, why have I never really stopped? That answer took longer to reach. Because your soulmate knew memory alone was not proof that two people belonged together. Nostalgia can make old moments appear brighter than they were. They wanted to be careful. So they asked themselves what exactly they missed about you. Was it attention? Familiarity? Comfort? Or something more specific? The answer emerged slowly. They missed how conversations with you made them think more deeply. They missed being challenged without being diminished. They missed the strange combination of peace and possibility they felt when you were around. They missed the way you could make ordinary moments feel meaningful without trying too hard. Most of all, they missed who they became when they allowed themselves to be emotionally present with you. That last realization mattered. Perhaps you had not simply represented a relationship. Perhaps you represented a version of their life where they were more open, more sincere, more connected to what they actually felt. And that was why forgetting you had proven so difficult. They were not only trying to forget a person. They were trying to forget a part of themselves. Suddenly, the third party's fear became understandable in a new way. Somewhere deep down, they may have sensed that your soulmate's connection to you was tied to identity, not just attraction. That is why extra time had never truly solved the problem. You cannot outweight someone's need to become more authentic. Eventually, the part of them that wants honesty begins asking louder questions. Your soulmate was finally hearing those questions clearly. And then something happened that moved the story forward again. Someone close to your soulmate, someone who had watched their behavior for longer than they realized, made an observation during an ordinary conversation. They did not mention you immediately. They simply said, "You seem different lately. Like you've finally stopped trying to convince yourself of something." Your soulmate froze for half a second. The comment was too accurate. They asked what the person meant, and the answer made them even more thoughtful. you used to talk like you already knew what you wanted, but you always looked uncertain. Now you sound uncertain about the details, but certain about yourself. That distinction stayed with your soulmate. Certain about yourself. Perhaps that was what had changed. They still did not know exactly what would happen with you. They did not know what you would say. They did not know how complicated the next conversation might become. But they finally knew which feelings were real and which choices had been made merely to avoid discomfort. And that kind of clarity does not need every answer before it begins moving. That evening, your soulmate returned to the message for the third time. This time, instead of adding more, they removed almost half of it. The long explanations disappeared. The sentences defending their past behavior disappeared. The parts that sounded like they were trying to persuade you disappeared. What remained was simple, honest, and surprisingly calm. Your soulmate looked at the screen and realized they were finally ready to send something without knowing what would come back. Their finger moved toward the final button. And then, just seconds before they made the choice the third party had feared from the beginning, your soulmate saw something connected to you that changed the meaning of the message entirely. It was not dramatic. It was not bad news. But it suggested that your life had moved in a direction they had never considered, and suddenly, they understood that reaching out to you might require much more courage than simply admitting they still cared.